Hi, everybody. Mr. Taylor here with part two of our epithelial, or epithelial, that's funny, integumentary system notes. I want to let you know that I've been having really bad technical glitches, and that's why this is kind of late coming out to you. And I want to let you know that I had to record this. This is now my probably third time through recording these notes because of all my technical glitches. So I am unable to draw on my screen today. So we're going to do the best that we can. So just try to follow along with my voice, and I'll try to make things as clear as possible. I will use my mouse. Hopefully you guys can see the mouse moving on the screen. But if not, actually, you know what? I can use a laser pointer. So I will be using that. So I'll go ahead and make sure that you guys can see what I'm trying to point you to. All right, so here's some warm-up questions. Go ahead and answer these. You can pause the video and answer them, and then when you unpause, I'll give you the answers. Here we go. All right, so question number one, helps you to feel touch. That would be the Merkel cells or Merkel discs. And I always remember Steve Urkel from Family Matters was very sensitive. So I remember Merkel is sensitive like Urkel. That's kind of silly, but it's just a good way to remember it. Great. The second one protects you from infections. These are the Langerhans cells. And I always think of Langerhans, sounds like some sort of like, crazy Austrian action movie star, kind of like Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I'm like, oh, Langerhans, or something like that. And he would just like attack all the pathogens, like bacteria and viruses trying to get into your body through the skin. All right, number three, makes up the bulk of the epidermis. This would be the keratinocytes, which are, of course, the keratin containing cells that are found in the skin and are the most common cell by far. The next one, number four, protects you from UV radiation. This would, of course, be the melanocytes that produce melanin, and its job is to protect you from the harmful effects of the sun through UV radiation. Number five, produces keratin, of course, would be the keratinocytes again. So they are the cells that carry the keratin. And number six, makes you tan, of course, would also be the melanocytes again, because melanin is a tan or black protein that gives your skin a tan or black color. So there you go. All right, so moving right along. Epidermis. So I'm sorry, this is the review from last time. So last time we learned about all the different cells of the epidermis, and that's what your warm-up was on. So hopefully you feel pretty good about that. If there's anything that you're not too sure about, just let me know and we'll talk about it. All right, so today we're going to learn more specifically about the layers of the epidermis. And so when we look at the epidermis, in your body, the most of your skin is what we consider to be thin skin that has four layers. And in fact, this is all of the skin in your body except for the palms of your hand and soles of your feet, the places where you have fingerprints. So those areas have thick skin, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But anyway, when we look at the epidermis, we see that there are four what we call strata. And so once again, like stratified epithelium, we have strata or layers that make up this thin skin. And so these are arranged from deepest to most superficial. So the stratum basale is the deepest layer. The stratum corneum is the most superficial. So we're looking at our illustration over here. Down here is our basal layer or stratum basale, the deep layer. And then up here is our stratum corneum or the top superficial layer. And the reason why I put it in order is because these cells grow from deep to superficial. So your youngest cells are down here in the stratum basale. Your oldest cells are up here in the stratum corneum. The stratum basale is where we find what are called basal cells. And basal cells is a fancy name for the stem cells that produce all the other skin cells. So down here, we have constantly dividing cells going through mitosis, producing all the cells that go up above them. So what happens is these split, and when they split, one of the cells pushes up into the higher layer, which then pushes cells up into the next layer, which then pushes cells up to the top, and then eventually cells slough off, that's the appropriate word, or flake off, and then they're just replaced by new cells. So these cells are almost constantly going through mitotic division to replace the other cells. This is also where we find the melanocytes, and you can see there's a little melanocyte down here with this kind of mustard yellow color, and its job is just to hang out down here in the basal layer and just produce melanin, which it then transfers through these melanosomes to all the keratinocytes carrying your tan up to the surface. And this is also where we find the Merkel cells. And so the Merkel cells stay rooted down here. You can see there's a little thing underneath of it that is a neuron. So Merkel cells themselves are not actually neurons, but they help neurons to sense touch. So basically, these are kind of like an extension of your nervous system that push up into the epidermis and help you to feel. And so these cells stay here their whole lives, so they don't move. All these cells stay here. It's just that the offspring of these cells that come out. Um, the next layer after that is what's called the stratum spinosum. And the stratum spinosum is made of spiny cells. So we have the basal basale, and then we have the spiny spinosum. And so the stratum spinosum, these cells have these things called desmosomes. And the prefix desmos means fiber. And so literally these are little fibrous growths that stick out of these cells and gives them kind of a spiny look. And these desmosomes actually have little hooks on them that helps to hook the cells together and helps your skin to not separate, or what we call delaminate. So it helps to keep it tight so it doesn't just like flake off right away. Now, these desmosomes are present in all the other layers as well. However, they're most noticeable in this layer because these cells are still pretty big and plump. As they get more tightly packed up at the top, the desmosomes are still there. You just can't really see them. This is also where we find the Langerhans cell. So there's a little Langerhans cell hanging out there. So if any sort of bacteria or virus or other pathogen makes its way all the way through down here to this layer, the Langerhans cell's job is to go over and kill it. So that's kind of what they're doing. They're just hanging out and killing any sort of pathogen. We also find that the keratinocytes, like I said, are still pretty plump. They're still pretty like almost cuboidal at this point. Not really that squamous yet, but they're on the way. As we move into the next layer, the third layer is the stratum granulosum. And so when we get to the granulosum up here, we also call this the granule cell layer because the cells are filled with lamellar granules. So it's the granulosum granules that go together. I always think these cells are kind of grainy, like they look like they have a lot of grains to them. So this is the grainy granulosum. And by this point, the cells are starting to get kind of old. So you can think of the stratum basale as being like the baby layer. So it's like baby basale. You go through kind of like adulthood in the spinosum. And then by the time the cells get up here to the granulosum, they're getting pretty old. And so they're getting kind of like crusty. And it's kind of like bread. You know, when you first get bread, it's nice and soft. And then it eventually starts to get hard and then crusty and stale. And that's what's happening here. And these granulosum cells are so old that they're starting to build up with these lamellar granules. They're getting hard and they're starting to get they're getting near the end of their life at this point. And then the last step, the stratum corneum, this is where the cells become really compacted, full of keratin, and dead. And so basically in the stratum granulosum, the cells start to die, and by the time they get to the corneum, they're completely dead. And the reason for this is that if you remember that epithelial tissue is avascular, down here in the basal layer, the stratum basale, these guys have lots of access to nutrients from the underlying connective tissue. The spinosum still has a pretty good amount of nutrients available to them, so it kind of diffuses through as interstitial fluid. By the time we get to the granulosum, because the lamellar granules are starting to make these cells tougher and more waterproof, they're not able to really pass the nutrients on, so they start to die. So they're far away and they're starting to block moisture. And then by the time we get up to the stratum corneum, these cells are completely dead. They're so far away and they're so waterproof that they can't even allow any sort of nutrients through, and that's it. And so this is a very thick layer, 25 to 30 layers. And so you can see this is much thicker, but the cells are a lot thinner too. But this is the layer that gives us our most protection. And in fact, the word corneum means hardened. So I always think of like corn. Like corn has like a really hard outer shell to it. It can pass through your entire digestive system pretty much intact, and that's why. And so this is a top-down view of the stratum corneum, and you can see all these cornified cells. They kind of look like corn flakes, in fact, or like scales, all just kind of layered over one of another. All right, the epidermis. Moving right along, we're going to look at the thick skin. So you can see I have a picture of some fingerprints here. The thick skin is only found in the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand. So those are the only two locations we're going to find them. And so this is the area that we call friction skin because this is where you have a lot of friction and you need a lot of grip. And so in these areas, if you notice, we still have a stratum basale, we still have a stratum spinosum, we still have a stratum granulosum. There's no change in the first three layers. But then we add an extra bonus layer. The fourth layer is called the stratum lucidum. And the word lucid, you've probably heard this before, like when someone's insane and they have a moment of clarity, they are lucid, right? Or if you're having a dream, lucid dreaming is when you wake up in your dream and you realize that you're dreaming. So the word lucid actually means clear. And the reason why we give it this name is because this is a clear layer of dead keratinocytes, because remember that the stratum granulosum is where they start to die, but this is where we find a lot of elidin. So in the thick skin, the cells kind of hang out here longer, and we see this like elidin clear layer that forms before they become fully keratinized. And so this helps to give us a little bit of extra protection, but it also is the reason why if you look at these fingerprints, they look different. If you look at the palm of your hand, the skin looks different than the skin in the rest of your body because of the stratum lucidum. We also find that the stratum corneum here is much, much, much thicker. It's like thick with like 5 C's on the end of it compared to the thin skin. So we have just a lot more of it. And as you get like calluses, it just gets thicker and thicker and thicker. So just like by default, like if you were to look at, like let's say you don't really work with your hands that much, you already have a lot more layers of stratum corneum on your hand. But then if you start doing something that requires a lot of wear and tear on your hands, you just grow more and more and more layers. It just hangs on longer. All right, and so what we find out here is that there's this process called keratinization. And keratinization means that we are increasing the amount of keratin in our cells. So when we start in the stratum basale, we basically have no keratin. In the spinosum, we have maybe a little bit of these lamellar granules, which we really start to notice in the stratum granulosum. So because we're starting to build up this kind of like keratin precursor, these are starting to get tough. By the lucidum, they're starting to get this elidin, so they're starting to toughen up even more. And by the time they get to the stratum corneum, they're fully keratinized. So as we go from deep to superficial, from the stratum basale to the stratum corneum, we go from the youngest cells to the oldest cells. We go from the softest cells to the hardest cells. So you can think about like soft, squishy babies. Babies are always really like soft and have like thin skin. As you get older, you get tougher and tougher, and then eventually you die and you just like this withered corpse. That's really sad, but that's how it works. And then eventually the stratum corneum just flakes off. So the most keratinized layer, of course, would be corneum. The least keratinized would be the stratum basale. And also with age, corneum are your oldest cells in a young person. They're about 4 weeks old, and the stratum basale are just constantly growing. And so this is just another diagram showing you the same thing. And you can see how the cells go from the basal cells to the cornified cells. They go from really big and plump to really kind of like flattened and hardened and crusty. And you can see the desmosomes holding them together. And you can see how each cell has desmosomes holding it on to the cell above it. So they're all linked. It's just that we see them down here in the stratum spinosum with these spinous cells. Great. This is another diagram, and you can see that actually the stratum basale, it's not like a flat layer. It actually undulates. It actually is kind of like folded, but we can see there's all our basal cells. There's our Merkel cell connected to a sensory neuron. Here is our melanocyte producing its melanosomes. Here's our Langerhans cell up here in the stratum spinosum. And then you can see the stratum spinosum is pretty thick because the cells are all pretty fat and when they get up here. But as we get up towards the top and we get up into the granulosum, they really start to flatten. Lucidum and corneum, they're like super flat, super compacted. And you can see that over here in this photomicrograph. Notice down here with these really like fat nuclei, like either cuboidal or maybe even columnar. As we go up, they become more flattened, and eventually they're completely gone because these are dead cells. So dead cells have no nuclei. All right, so that's it for the epidermis. Now we're going to take a little tour of the dermis. And the dermis, compared to the epidermis, is very different. It's made of connective tissues, mostly dense, irregular connective tissue with lots of collagen, some elastin to give a little bit of stretch. So not like dense elastic where it is a lot of stretch like an artery, but a little bit of stretch just to help us, with our joints and our movement. And so the dermis actually is way simpler than the epidermis. The epidermis, even though it's thinner, it is way more complex because of all the different layers and cells. In the dermis, we only have 2 separate layers. The top layer is called the papillary layer. And the reason why it's called papillary layer is papilla is Latin for nipple. And what happened was someone looked at this layer and thought it looked like a nipple. And let me go back and show you for a second. Do you see all these little ridges sticking up? These are called dermal papillae, or dermal papilla is the singular. And so literally, dermal papilla means skin nipple. So somebody thought these guys looked kind of like little nipples sticking up, and that's where the name comes from. Now, in biology, anytime we see something that's like folded up like this, we know that we're trying to increase surface area. So this is increasing the surface area in the interface between the dermis and the epidermis. And you can see how different the cells look at this interface. In these little ridges that stick up of these dermal papillae, we see a lot of different things. We see a lot of blood vessels shown in this diagram. So there's a lot of little blood vessels down here because the epidermis is avascular. So the papillary layer allows blood, not directly, but the nutrients from the blood to go up into these tissues and allows the waste products from these cells to go back into the blood and be drained by the veins. It also provides nervous tissue because even though we always talked about how epiderm or epithelium is innervated, in the epidermis, most of the nerve cells actually stop right here at the border. Now, there can be little bits of what are called free nerve endings that can stick out into here a little bit, but most of the neurons are actually found in the dermal papillae. So the idea here is we're trying to push all these blood vessels and nerves up as close to the surface as we can so they can get as close to the top without being at risk of being damaged. And so that's what we're doing here. We're also increasing the amount of surface area in between so that all these nice basal cells have a lot of room to grow and they have a lot of access to the things that they need to grow. So that's how we're able to be avascular and have a high capacity for renewal, for those of you that were interested. So the papillary layer has two very special things inside of it. One is called a Meissner's corpuscle of touch. And a Meissner's corpuscle of touch also senses touch, but it's a bit different from a Merkel disc. And we'll talk about this more in the nervous system chapter. So for right now, there's no need to know what the difference is, but just know that there's different types of touch and then there's different types of touch receptors. A Meissner's corpuscle of touch looks like this. And so you can see this little kind of like oval shaped thing here. It's called a corpuscle, and it gets that name from the Latin corpus, which means body. And so corpuscle means like little body. And so they would name a lot of things corpuscles when they would find like little weird like masses when scientists were first looking at the body under the microscope and they didn't know what they did. And so eventually they found out this was touch sensitive. And so this little thing you can kind of think of as like a water balloon. And so when something pushes down on your skin and compresses your epidermis, it also compresses this Meissner's corpuscle. And just like if you had a full water balloon and you push down on it, it would kind of like pancake out to the sides. The more that something pushes on your skin, the more this Meissner's corpuscle pancakes, and then that sends signals back to the brain to tell you that you're feeling something. And you can see just how high this is sticking up. This is a particularly tall dermal papilla getting very close to the surface as compared to like some of these other regions, down here in the bottom of the papillary layer that are much farther. Okay, the other thing we find are what are called free nerve endings. And a free nerve ending is just like a naked neuron. It's basically the neuron that has its dendrites or these little like cellular processes sticking out, kind of like antennas. And free nerve endings, you couldn't really see them in this picture because they're too small. But what happens is that they come up to the surface, and then from that neuron, they stick out little tiny projections, like almost like little wires, out into the epidermis. And these free nerve endings are the things that feel temperature, both hot and cold, and they feel pain. So if you've ever noticed that like you can poke your skin and you can feel pain without actually breaking through the skin and bleeding, that's because these free nerve endings are actually extending out into the epidermis a bit. And so they're very close to the surface to allow us to feel temperature and pain through our skin. And so when we talk about like hitting a nerve, literally when you hit a nerve, you're hitting one of the dendrites or processes from one of these free nerve endings. Okay, and that brings us to the very last section, which is the deep part of the dermis, also known as the reticular layer. And whenever I say reticular, you're going to, of course, think net. And that's because this has a very net-like structure to it. So the reticular layer, it's the deeper dermis, it's the thicker part of the dermis, it's the strongest part of the dermis, and it's also the net-like part of the dermis. And in fact, if you look at this weird picture I have down here, this is a map of the general direction of all the collagen fibers in the reticular layer. And so when you look at it microscopically, you see that there are just like collagen fibers going in all different directions because, of course, this is dense, irregular connective tissue. But what they found out over the years is surgeons have found that there is a general overall trend to the direction in which the collagen fibers run. And this is a map showing that. And this is actually a map that is used by plastic surgeons in order to help hide scars. So they found out that if you were to do a surgery, and let's say we had to cut out like a mole off of this person's cheek, if you cut straight down, you'd be cutting through all these major bands. And when you pull all them back together and put a suture on it, it would end up with a pretty ugly scar. But they found out if you followed these lines and you were able to make your incision along these lines and then pull them together and stitch it up, it makes the scars almost invisible. So if you ever wondered how like plastic surgeons are able to do all these like facelifts and nose jobs and all this kind of stuff, and you really can't tell, that's how they actually follow the lines of the collagen. And in this picture in the lower left, you can actually see these little guys down here are stretch marks, also known as striae. So striae is like the technical name for them. Once again, like striations are like, banded appearance. So these striae are these areas where the skin is stretched so much in the hip region here on this person that the collagen fibers have actually separated. As strong as they are, those bands can be pulled apart, and you can see how thick all those bands are and how they kind of have a general direction that they run in between where they separated, the body is filled in those gaps with scar tissue. And scar tissue doesn't exactly act like regular skin. And so it doesn't get as pigmented. It has like a lighter coloration to it. And you can see that the skin itself is actually ruptured and had to like kind of heal itself. And so, of course, when you put on weight, whether it's muscle or fat, or if you have an area that gets a lot of bending and flexing, so like a hip is possible. Some people get these in like their armpit areas because in your armpit shoulder area you do a lot of flexing and moving. Just from those stretches you can start to get these striae or stretch marks. Anyway, so in the reticular layer, once again, it's dense, irregular connective tissue. So we find mostly a lot of collagen fibers and fibroblasts. But we also find some other things here. For example, we find adipocytes. So there is some fat storage that happens here. This is one of the reasons why like eating chicken skin is not very healthy for you. Hair follicles. Your hair actually goes all the way down through the papillary layer and the epidermis all the way down into this reticular layer. And that's how hair is able to stay rooted into your body and not fall out easily. Nerves. A lot of nerves are found down here in the reticular layer. And in fact, if you've ever cut deeply through the skin, it is not a fun time and it hurts like crazy because you have a lot of nerves here. And this is also where oil and sweat glands come from. And so we find out this is a very glandular region. Those glands actually reach all the way up to the surface. And that's the end. But I want to show you one thing really fast. This is just a cross section of the skin. And you can see here's your hair follicle going all the way down. So you can see how much thicker the dermis is compared to the epidermis. You can see the sweat gland goes all the way down. In fact, just the very little end of it is in the epidermis, goes all the way down to the reticular layer. And then you can see all the neurons running through this region. And so this is why, like, if you just like stick a pin into your finger like a little bit, it might hurt a little bit. But if you stick it all the way through your skin, it's going to hurt like crazy because you have way more nerve endings down here. Also, you can just see all these blood vessels running up. So you have larger blood vessels down here very deep in the skin, but they do have a lot of capillaries that run up very close to the surface of the epidermis, especially up into the dermal papillae to provide that blood flow to the epidermis. So the skin's pretty complicated. It's got a lot of layers, it's got a lot of stuff going on, but you can see not all the layers are created equal. By far, the reticular is the thickest and heaviest layer of the skin. The papillary layer is not that thick. It's pretty small and convoluted. And the epidermis is really pretty thin too. So, all right. Well, that's it. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you guys got a lot out of this, and I will see you in school very soon. Take care.